Hi, welcome back to my channel with my so many subscribers. I know, I'm so famous. Anyways, today I'm going to be talking about an MMIWG case, which is a missing and murdered Indigenous woman and girls case. I got most of the information from a book called Highway of Tears by Jessica McDermott, I believe, so I want to give all the credit. She did an amazing job highlighting cases that aren't very widely known about and just highlighting the horror of Highway 16 and the Highway of Tears in British Columbia, Canada. I've deterred slightly from my plan. I did some other videos when I was planning on doing Ramona's, like Brittany. So now we're back on track with Ramona's video, so here we go. Today I'm going to be speaking about Ramona Wilson, who went missing from Smithers, British Columbia in 1994, and her body was found the following year. For context, I need to give you some background on an infamous highway that's located in British Columbia, Canada. Highway 16 in British Columbia is known for being the location where many Indigenous women go missing or are murdered. Highway 16 was created around the 1950s and it connects two cities, smallish cities in British Columbia. It connects Prince George and Prince Rupert, and the highway spans 725 kilometers. There are very few towns along this stretch of the highway, and many of the towns that are located there are very sparsely populated, like it's under 10,000 people, including Smithers, which is where Ramona was from. Many of these towns are extremely impoverished, and a lot of residents struggle with a variety of issues that are exacerbated by poverty and lack of resources, such as being more vulnerable to sexual exploitation, higher rates of drug dependency, and untreated mental illness. There are little resources for these residents to receive help, support, or treatment to meet their needs. It's unknown who the first victim from the Highways of Tears is, but it is estimated or believed widely that the first victim predates the 1970s. It's also unknown how many women and girls have gone missing from the Highway of Tears, but there have been dozens of cases reported, many of which are Indigenous women. Nationwide, all across Canada, there is a major issue of violence against Indigenous women and girls. It was found in a study that Indigenous women are 6 times more likely to be murdered than non-Indigenous women in Canada. Since it's unknown and historically underreported how many Indigenous women have gone missing nationwide in Canada, there have been grassroots activists and groups that travel throughout Canada and into small communities and reserves to collect the names of missing and murdered. These groups estimate that the total number of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls is over 4,000, while the RCMP says that it's only around 1,200. 1,000 of those 1,200 cases reported by the RCMP are homicides. So if you don't know, the RCMP stands for the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. So the RCMP is a major police service in Canada and it has a large presence in British Columbia. Ramona Lisa Wilson was born on February 15, 1978 at the Bulkley Valley Hospital, District Hospital in Smithers, BC. Her mother, Matilda Wilson, was told 6 or 7 years prior that she couldn't have any more children. She had already had 5 children before she was told this. Her eldest, Brenda Wilson, was disappointed by this because she really badly wanted a sister, as all her siblings were boys, but Matilda was okay with this. Despite this announcement, in the summer of 1977, Matilda started getting flu-like symptoms, so she went to the hospital and learned that she was 2 months pregnant. Matilda started experiencing contractions on February 14th, 1978, and even though Ramona was born on the following day, Matilda still called her sweetheart baby because she started experiencing contractions on Valentine's Day. So Matilda Wilson had a really devastating childhood, and I'm going to briefly recount her childhood childhood because I think it will add more context to Ramona's case and the racism that exists against Indigenous peoples in Canada. Matilda was born to Arthur Sampson and his wife Mary. The family moved back to Gittinmax, where Arthur was born, after one of their daughters passed away because they wanted better access to medical care and education for their children. Gittinmax is an Indigenous community near Hazelton, British Columbia. After they moved back to Gittinmax, Matilda was born in 1950. She was the first one to be born and delivered by an actual doctor and not just a family member. Matilda was the 7th out of 14 children in total born to her parents. When Matilda was just 5 years old, the RCMP came to her house and removed her and her siblings from the care of her parents to be put into residential schools. Arthur and Mary tried to refuse this, but they were told by the RCMP that if they resisted their children getting taken from their home, they would be arrested. So they realized it was a lose-lose, that their children would be taken either way if they fought or not, so they just had to let them. If you don't know what residential schools are, I'll give you a definition that I got from the Canadian Encyclopedia. So it describes residential schools, and I quote, "Residential schools were government-sponsored religious schools that were established to assimilate Indigenous children into Euro-Canadian culture." So essentially, residential schools were this horrific collaboration between the Christian churches and the Canadian government to sort of eradicate Indigenous and First Nations culture and forcibly take children from their home to assimilate them into their Western ideal life that they thought was better. So the last residential school in Canada was shut down in 1996, so not that long ago, and residential schools existed in Canada for over 100 years. We're now aware from the testimony of very brave Indigenous peoples of the treatment and the severe abuse that they faced in residential schools. For instance, they were beaten if they were found speaking their native language. Sexual abuse was very common by the staff at residential schools, and I think that residential schools need to be talked about more, even though it is a horrific part of Canadian history, but we need to acknowledge it to make reparation. I'm not going to describe what happened in depth to the youth in these residential schools just because it's so horrific, but you can do more research and I'll put more resources below. As a result of the severe abuse faced at the residential schools, there were a lot of deaths, but since the schools didn't keep meticulous records about the death or the abuse, it is unknown how many kids and youth died at these schools. But the total number of deaths at residential schools caused by these staff or other abuse taking place is estimated to be over 6,000. Now I'm going to go back to Matilda. So when Matilda was 5 years old, she was forced to go to Le Jacques Residential School, which is a residential school in Fraser Lake, British Columbia. So when I googled the distance, it seemed to be about a 3.5-hour drive from Gittinmax. She was taken there on a train though. Matilda said that when she arrived at Le Jacques, they stripped her naked, they forced her into a cold shower, and then they shaved her head. She said the staff assigned her a number and would refer to her as her number instead of calling her by her birth name. During her time at Le Jacques, she faced emotional, physical, and sexual abuse. At Le Jacques, as I mentioned before, the kids were beaten, including Matilda, if she was caught speaking her native language, and sometimes as punishment, the students were starved. Le Jacques is most infamously known for a case of these 4 boys ran away and they died from being out in the weather and the cold, and their bodies were found only kilometers away from their home. Matilda said that during this time when their kids were taken from them, Arthur and Mary, her parents, developed an alcohol dependency to cope with what was happening. Matilda spent 7 years at Le Jacques before she was allowed to return home. So she was around 12 or 13. Matilda says that her family never truly recovered from what happened to them and from being torn apart at such a young age. Mary tragically died from a heart attack when she was 24 years old, and then 5 years later her father Arthur died after being hit by a drunk driver as he was getting out of a taxi. Matilda had her first child at 15, which was her daughter Brenda Wilson, and then she married her baby's father shortly after that. She and her husband had 4 other kids by the time Matilda turned 21, and they were all boys. All 4 of those were boys. Matilda's husband tragically passed away when Matilda was only 23, and after her death, she moved with her children to Smithers, BC. Smithers, BC is a majority white town, as are many of those towns that populate Highway 16. In Smithers, Matilda gave birth to Ramona, and then as a single mother, she raised her 5 children, excluding Brenda, who at that time, when Ramona was very young still, moved out to start her own family. So Ramona's family belongs to Gitxsan Nation, which is an indigenous community in Canada. Their native land is located in northwestern British Columbia. The family belongs to the Wolf clan. When her family describes Ramona, they say she was extremely extroverted and friendly and was very well liked by everyone, especially at school. Her first cousin described her as, quote, not only beautiful, she was smart, brave, tenacious, and had an effervescent personality. When Ramona was young and she had nightmares, she would climb into her mother's bed and the two would stay up talking for hours. Matilda said that even when Ramona was a teenager, 15 or 16, she would continue to sleep with her mom and the pair would talk all through the night. Ramona was also an avid poetry writer, and her mom was always excited to hear the new poetry verse that Ramona had written. I tried to find some of Ramona's poetry because I think it would have been beautiful to write or put in this video, but sadly I can't find any. When Ramona was only 12 years old, she told Matilda that when she grew up she wanted to be a psychologist. She was known for always lending a listening ear to someone in need and was always willing to help anyone. Matilda and Ramona decided that after Ramona graduated from high school, she would attend the University of Victoria, where she would study psychology. Ramona had made it to graduate high school. She would have been the first one out of her family to actually graduate and attend post-secondary school. I want to note here that the book Highway of Tears, where I got most of my information from, states that less than 24% of Indigenous youth graduated from where the time and location where Ramona lived. When Ramona was 14 years old, she started playing baseball as an outfielder. The team she joined was sponsored by the Native Friendship Center. Around this time, she also started her first part-time job at Smitty's, which is a Canadian franchise. It's just supposed to emulate a family restaurant. As a Canadian, I've never actually seen or been to a Smitty's restaurant. They seem to be more located in smaller towns like Smithers and not where I'm at. She worked as a dishwasher, and it was said that she never missed a shift at work. When Ramona started high school, she would behave like any average teenager. She would occasionally skip school to hang out with friends and would drink socially at parties. One of her closest friends, Crystal Granke, remembers Ramona as being the responsible one. In one article I read, Crystal described Ramona as being relatively quiet but strong-minded when she thought there was an injustice against someone or something. Crystal credits Ramona's friendship with her as being the reason why she eventually went down the right path. The pair became friends relatively early on in their high school career. Previously, Crystal had been sent to juvie for a charge of assault and often hung out with the wrong crowd who was very into partying and hardcore drugs. Ramona wasn't super big into partying. She would occasionally go, and I think that her presence had a very positive impact on Crystal's life. Crystal is now a single mother of 4 kids and is a pretty successful businesswoman in the credit union sector. She's been promoted quite a bit throughout her years working. It speaks volumes to me about the kind of person Ramona was and just her soul on how she was able to help Crystal want to live a good life. So now I'm fast forwarding to mid-June 1994, the month that Ramona Wilson disappeared. Throughout mid-June, June in Smithers, a lot of youth and young adults attend graduation parties to celebrate recent high school graduates. The weekend that Ramona disappeared, she was planning on attending a graduation party on Saturday night. On Friday, June 10th, 1994, Ramona excitedly came home and told her mom that she was going to give in her notice at Smitty's because she had been offered a job as a peer counselor at Smithers Community Services Association. Matilda remembers that Ramona said it was the best day of her life. That night, that Friday night, Ramona left her house to go stay with her boyfriend, who lived nearby in Morristown. Morristown, which is now called Whitsett, I believe, is around a 30-minute drive from Smithers. The next day, on June 11th, Saturday, Ramona returned to Smithers around noon. I believe her boyfriend would have driven her back home because he did have a car. Before she returned home, she stopped at a local steakhouse called Mr. Mike's where one of her friends were working. She picked up a bag of clothes from her friend that was on shift. Ramona then left the steakhouse and started walking home. On her walk home, her uncle was driving down the street and spotted Ramona walking, and he pulled over to talk to her briefly. Basically, the conversation consisted of her uncle asking her what her plans were for later that day because he could offer her a ride because he planned on being the designated driver for others in their family. Ramona apparently told her uncle that she was planning on attending a party at a sort of sketchy-ish apartment in Lake Kathleen, which is in Smithers, because a guy who lived in that apartment complex was hosting the party. After this brief conversation with her uncle, I don't think they made a plan for the driving. Ramona arrived home. Matilda said Ramona was in a relatively good mood when she arrived home. Ramona ended up taking a nap and woke up at around 6 p.m. After she woke up, Ramona, her mother, and her brother, one of her brothers, ate takeaway lasagna and watch TV together. At 9:30 p.m., it's reported that Ramona speaks to someone on the phone. Matilda initially assumed that the person Ramona was talking to on the phone was Crystal because Ramona had told Matilda that she was sleeping over at Crystal's that weekend. Crystal later confirmed that the phone call wasn't with her, and I don't know. I think it's unknown who she was on the phone with. Matilda wasn't aware that Ramona was attending a graduation party that night. Ramona and Crystal often spent most weekends together sleeping over at each other's house and sometimes would lie to their parents and would sneak out like typical teenagers do to parties or to hang out with other friends. After the phone call, Ramona finished getting ready and packed an overnight bag. That night, Ramona was wearing an acid wash jean jacket and new pink and white Reebok high tops that Matilda had recently bought her. Shortly after this, Ramona leaves the house. She walks down an alleyway to Alfred Avenue, which then will connect her to Main Street, which is where she was going. When she was walking down Alfred Avenue, there were two separate sightings of Ramona. The first was when Ramona walked by and waved to an elderly lady who was in her front yard with her son and her grandson. The second sighting was by a group of people that Ramona knew. There was a small party being held at a house along Alfred Avenue, and she stopped to talk to some people she knew at the party briefly. Across town, earlier that day, Crystal had attended her older brother's graduation ceremony. The ceremony was held at the Civic Center across the street from where Crystal lived, and Crystal lived around 12 blocks away from where Ramona lived on Railway Avenue. Sometime during that day, Ramona and Crystal had spoken on the phone, not the 9:30 call, different occasion, and they had made plans to meet up later that night at a dance in Hazleton. Hazleton is around 75 kilometers away or an hour drive from Smithers. And to get to Hazleton, you would take Highway 16. There was no access to public transit along Highway 16 at this point in time except for very infrequent Greyhound buses. So if you didn't have access to a car or a ride, it was very common for people of all ages to hitchhike along Highway 16 to get where they needed to go. Many people hitchhiked out of necessity. They had no other options since there was no public transit and taxis were expensive and hard her to come by. Crystal and Ramona did sometimes hitchhike along Highway 16 together or by themselves, but Crystal was way more comfortable than Ramona doing this. More often than hitchhiking off Highway 16, Crystal and Ramona would walk down Main Street, which is sort of the downtown area in Smithers, and just ask around and talk to people. Main Street was sort of a local hangout for teens and young adults in Smithers. There's not much to do, it's a small town. So they'd walk around until they saw an acquaintance or a friend that was going in the same place or the same direction they were planning to go, so they could hitch a ride with them. It's really unclear what Ramona was planning to do. She was planning to attend the party at Lake Kathleen first and then go to Hazleton. I think, using my own common sense, since the apartment is in Smithers, she would go to that first before traveling all the way to Hazleton to the dance. There is also evidence that Ramona actually did make it to the party at Lake Kathleen, which I'll detail a little more later. There's not a lot of evidence in this case though. So Ramona never made it to the dance in Hazleton, and Crystal wasn't too worried about this at the time because since there was no cell phone access, it wasn't like the two girls could talk to each other if their plans changed. So Crystal just assumed that Ramona had made other plans or got caught up at a different party or something like that. She also figured that Ramona might be with her boyfriend in Morristown, or a mutual friend that's only identified as Dustin, who also lived in Morristown. The next day on Sunday morning, Ramona's boyfriend called her house to talk to Ramona, and then Matilda told her boyfriend, he's never identified in any records or anything, so I just have to call him by her boyfriend. But she told Ramona's boyfriend that Ramona was with Crystal. So then Ramona's boyfriend calls Crystal, who tells him that no, Ramona isn't with her. Ramona's boyfriend drives out to Smithers to pick up Crystal around 11:30 a.m. so the two can try to locate where Ramona is. They first went to Matilda's house to check if maybe at this point Ramona had made it home. Crystal told Ramona's boyfriend to go to the door because she didn't want Ramona to get in trouble if Crystal went, because Matilda's mom assumed Ramona was Crystal. So Ramona's boyfriend goes to the door and Matilda says nope, she's still with Crystal. Later that day, Crystal calls Smitty's to see if maybe Ramona is at work. One of Ramona's co-workers tells Crystal that Ramona isn't scheduled to work until the following Monday after school. Crystal and Ramona's boyfriend sort of wrapped it up for the day, figuring that Ramona was just with a friend and that they'd see her soon. So now we go to Monday, June 13th, 1994, 2 days after Ramona is last seen. Crystal goes to school and Ramona and the friend that Ramona might be staying with, Dustin, both don't go to school that Monday. They're not at school that Monday. Crystal wasn't overly concerned about this yet because, as I said before, Ramona occasionally skipped school. Maybe she was sick, maybe there's a million things that could be happening, but she figured that Ramona would for sure not miss her shift that she had at Smitty's that day after school because she was planning on handing her notice to her boss. So after school, Crystal starts her shift at Petro-Canada, which is a gas station franchise in Canada, and she tells her boss that she needs to make a call. Her boss says okay. She goes to the back office and she calls Smitty's to see if Ramona made it to her shift. They told her that no, Ramona never showed up to her shift that day. This is the point when Crystal truly panics, and at this point she knows Matilda still thinks that Ramona is with Crystal, so Crystal calls Matilda to tell her that she has no idea where Ramona is. She confesses to Matilda that Ramona didn't stay with her that weekend and that she hasn't shown up to work or school that Monday. After speaking with Crystal, Matilda calls Smitty's again to see if maybe Ramona has now arrived at her shift. She has not. So then Matilda calls her eldest daughter Brenda to come over and help her make calls to friends and family to try to locate Ramona. After calling around a bit, Brenda and Matilda learn about the party that Ramona had planned on attending at Lake Kathleen that Saturday night. I don't know know if they were told on this call conclusively if Ramona had showed up to that party or not. Then the pair drove to Smitty's to see maybe Ramona had showed up finally. She hadn't. At this point, Matilda decided that she was going to report her daughter missing to the local RCMP detachment in Smithers. So the officers initially blew Matilda off. They told her to wait it out a couple days, that Ramona was probably just staying with a friend or had briefly run off. This was sort of a huge slap in the face to Matilda and Brenda, who knew that Ramona wouldn't do this to them, and they also had a very troubled history with the RCMP, so it was difficult for them to have to reach out for help from the RCMP. It's no secret that there's a lot of mistrust between Indigenous communities and the RCMP. Studies have shown that the RCMP are disproportionately violent towards Indigenous peoples. I'll bet not all RCMP officers are blatantly racist and violent towards a marginalized community. It is significant enough that there is notable racism in the force. So knowing this history and this systemic racism pattern in the RCMP, it's understandable why Matilda and Brenda would be sort of not gung-ho about having to reach out to them for help. In the book Highway of Tears, Matilda explains that she believed the RCMP detachment blew her off and said Ramona was a runaway because they were basically insinuating that Matilda couldn't provide a happy home life for Ramona because she was a single mother on welfare, so that's why Ramona must have run away. Since Smithers is a very small town, it's also likely that the officers that they reported to already knew of the Wilson family because one of Matilda's older brothers had some conflict with the law. Matilda knew that Ramona wouldn't do this. Ramona always knew that Matilda worried, and she would always call her mom and update where she was if she was gone for a few days. After doing research into this case, I know how much Matilda loves her daughter and how much Matilda loves her children. They are the most important thing to her. Ramona was loved and did have a good home life despite the financial struggles that they faced. After their unsuccessful visit to the RCMP detachment, Ramona's family and friends start searching for her right away. Matilda and Brenda continued to make phone calls around to try to locate or get more information about Ramona's whereabouts, while her other family members, uncles, aunts, and her brothers drove throughout Smithers trying to find her. There was no media coverage about Ramona's disappearance until 11 days after she was last seen, and even then it was a very brief description of her disappearance. After that Saturday that Ramona was last seen, there was no activity in her bank account, and she never picked up her check at Smitty's. This proved even more to her family that Ramona had not run away, because she would have had to access her money or picked up her check to sort of sustain her life as a runaway. Then the RCMP finally starts investigating Ramona's case a few days later, I think, not 100% sure, but they still aren't for sure treating her case as foul play. They still sort of believe she's a runaway. Over the next few weeks, it's reported that police searched Highway 16 from Talcott to Morristown, which are towns along the highway. They performed a helicopter search and then a ground search over the Bulkley River and followed up on more than 100 tips, and they found nothing. After the RCMP failed to find anything, the MCSC, the Missing Children Society of Canada, was brought in by the RCMP to aid in the investigation. The MCSC is an organization that originated in Alberta to provide more resources and help to ongoing disappearances and missing persons cases across Canada. They connect investigators to additional resources such as forensic artists, sniffer dogs, more search and rescue teams, such stuff like that. They also help in media campaigns to help families spread information on their loved ones' cases. At this time, Rhonda Morgans was the executive director at MCSC. She arrived in Smithers on July 5th, 1994 to help in Ramona's case. Rhonda and her team brought in a psychic named Mary Martin from Louisiana to help them aid Ramona's case in the search. They brought brought Mary in after she had phoned up MCSC and said some promising things. I'm not sure what the promising things are. During her trip to Smithers, Mary finds nothing, so she returns to Louisiana. So does Rhonda and her team. They don't return to Louisiana, but they return home to Alberta. So when Mary returned home to Louisiana, she contacts Rhonda and tells her that a spirit gave her all these tips and clues about Ramona's disappearance. Mary said a spirit had told her that Ramona was located at the end of an airport runway. She said this as well as other clues, which were, quote, white mound, the color yellow, a pond and 2 waterfalls, the phrase airport 4, and a pattern of lights that Mary drew out and faxed to Rhonda. Rhonda returned to Smithers for the second time in August to continue the investigation. She went to Smithers Airport and to follow up on Mary's tips, and she saw that at both sides of the airport there were big signs that said airport 4. So later that day, Rhonda returns to that airport and she tells staff about what she's trying to do. So they turn on the runway lights, and Rhonda sees that the pattern of the runway lights match the drawing of the pattern of lights that Mary gave Rhonda. Intrigued by this revelation, one of the employees at the airport asks Rhonda what some of the other clues were. Rhonda tells this man that one of the other clues was the color yellow. So the man tells Rhonda that there is a street a few blocks away from the airport called Yellich Road. So Rhonda and one of the other investigators of MCSC drives down Yellich Road the next day, but they give up shortly after because they felt silly. So Rhonda went to the apartment at Lake Kathleen with another investigator from MCSC to speak to people that had been at that party and the guy who owned the apartment or rented the apartment. Someone warned them, I believe it was someone from the RCMP, that the people at the apartment were known drug dealers and were violent and probably wouldn't be cooperative. So Rhonda and this other investigator made multiple trips to the apartment, but throughout all the trips, all the people there denied knowing anything about Ramona's disappearance, and they denied that they even saw Ramona at the party that night. Meanwhile, Matilda and Brenda are struggling to raise money for a reward for information in Ramona's case. They did so many raffles and sold clothing and sold 1,000,001 things, and even Brenda hosted a dance, and they only ended up raising $500. On January 21st, 1995, the RCMP received an anonymous tip from a man. The caller told the RCMP that his friend had told him what happened to Ramona and that her body could be found west of Smithers. Officers said the tip was promising and urged the caller to call back, even going so far as Matilda had to make a public plea begging the tipper to call back and that she promised that there would not be charges put against him, but please call back with more information. He never called back. The MCSC around this time put forward a $10,000 reward for information in either Ramona or Delphine's cases. Delphine is another missing girl that went missing a few years before Ramona along Highway 16. I'll talk about her case in a future video most likely. So on April 19th, 1995, around 9-10 months after Ramona initially goes missing, there are 2 teenage boys four-wheeling in a clearing just off of Yellich Road. They get their vehicle stuck in the mud, so they go into this woody patch to try to find a branch or something to pry their vehicles or get their vehicles out of the mud. While they're searching, they find a body in a thicket under a bush under a tree. This body was positively identified as Ramona through dental records. Near Ramona's body, there were some strange things found. There was a piece of bright yellow rope, 3 white nylon cables, and a small brass knuckle style water gun, and clothing, which was a purple sweatshirt and leggings. It was reported that Ramona's body lay under the thicket completely naked and that the items around her were organized. Matilda was informed about this discovery. I don't know by who. She says she wasn't informed by the RCMP, that she was informed by another person. So she goes down to the RCMP detachment attachment to identify the clothing, and when she gets there she positively identifies that the purple sweatshirt and the leggings are Ramona's. Ramona's new pink and white high top Reeboks were never found. Her remains were sent to Vancouver for an autopsy, and also a forensic team from Vancouver flew out to Smithers to collect evidence. Ramona's cause of death or any information about forensics that were found on the crime scene were never released to the public, and Ramona's family still doesn't know Ramona's actual cause of death to this day. The RCMP are known for being ultra secretive to the point where they sort of almost allegedly block out families from the investigation, such as what they did to the Wilson family in this case. I don't understand why it would be necessary for the RCMP not to give the Wilson family Ramona's autopsy or just give her cause of death. It seems very sketchy and weird to me that they didn't. Ramona's family has been very vocal throughout the decades since this case happened about how the RCMP did shut them out and how secretive they were. They said they felt like they had to go out of their way to pester the RCMP for tiny scraps of information about Ramona's case, when it should be the RCMP's job to reach out to the family, to give them updates, and to just keep them involved. A family that has suffered so much and has lost such a good soul deserved so much better treatment than how the RCMP treated the Wilson family. Initially, the police did say that they believed the murder was sexually motivated, which was backed up by her body being found naked, and I guess maybe forensics that we haven't as a public had access to. After the forensic team wraps up their little scaling and investigation at the crime scene where Ramona's body was found, two of Matilda's sisters and Ramona's cousin Rachel, went out to the scene where Ramona's body was found. In Indigenous cultures in some of the communities, it is a part of their culture to go to the site of where someone has passed and bless the land so that their soul can be at peace and be at rest. So that was the purpose of them going out to her crime scene. When Rachel, I'm going to call her Rachel, I'm so sorry if I'm pronouncing it wrong. When Rachel went to where Ramona's body was found, she fell to her knees and started sobbing, and she started like clawing at the ground, and she said when she clawed at the ground she looked at her hands and she had a piece of material, so like a piece of denim, and hair. So she was like so distraught. This is most likely associated with Ramona's case, like she could be holding the hair of the person who did this to Ramona. So they put it in an envelope and then they drive out to the RCMP and they give the envelope to the RCMP, and they've never received a phone call updating them on what happened with the material. But Matilda did say that the material seemed like the denim that Ramona was wearing the night she disappeared. The family was so upset by this because obviously this proves that the RCMP and their Vancouver forensic team didn't do their due diligence and didn't do a good search. Ramona's case seemed to go cold for the next decade, but her family, especially Matilda and Brenda, never stopped fighting and seeking justice. Since June of 1995, the Wilson family has organized annual walks to garner media attention along Highway 16 for Ramona. In 2005, the RCMP started a task force called EPANA to investigate in the Highway of Tears cases that remained unsolved. EPANA was later extended to include other unsolved cases of missing and murdered women that had gone missing along different highways in British Columbia. Ramona's murder was one of 18 cases that was included in this investigation. To be included in the EPANA investigation, you had to meet 4 criteria, which were: it had to involve a female, the victims had to be engaged in at least one high-risk behavior, which they describe as hitchhiking, being involved in sex work or exploitation of their minor. They went missing or their body was found near Highway 16, 597 or 24 in British Columbia, and then evidence indicated a stranger attack, which means that the victim didn't know their attacker. The main goal of EPANA was to sort of determine if a serial killer was involved in these cases, because it is highly speculated that this is probable. The previous year, in 2004, the RCMP's behavioral branch found that it was likely, or found evidence that 3 cases along the Highway of Tears could be linked. These 3 cases were Ramona Wilson, Roxanne Tiara, and Alicia Germain. The 3 girls all went missing between June 1994, starting with Ramona, and then December 1994. So in a 5-6 month span. In 2006, private investigator Ray Machalko started looking into Highway of Tears cases, including Ramona's. In March 2008, Ray said he interviewed a man who said that he was present at Ramona's murder. The man provided Ray with other names of people that witnessed the crime, and he also showed Ray where the crime took place and showed him a wrecked vehicle that the man claimed was involved in Ramona's death. So Ray took the man to the Smithers RCMP to just relay that information to the officers. When they arrived at the detachment, Ray was dumbfounded when the RCMP officers didn't even know who Ramona was. Ray leaves this man to tell the authorities, the RCMP, what he said to Ray, and then a few months later, Ray follows up with this guy. He calls him and he's like, so like, what's happened? Have they interviewed you? This guy says that after that day, the RCMP has never contacted him again for further information or more details. The RCMP and Ray have notable beef because Ray is very vocal about his criticisms of the RCMP, and the chief of the RCMP contacted Ray and told him to stop interviewing witnesses and investigating Highways of Tears cases. Ray said that he would stop interviewing witnesses, but he would not stop following up on tips because he continued to receive them through his website. I want to note that a lot of the families involved in the Highway of Tears cases think of Ray very highly and are very happy with his work. They feel very heard and very communicated with Ray, including Matilda Wilson. Now we're going to get into theories. So to this day, in 2020, EPANA says there is no prime suspect in Ramona's murder, which is disappointing. There also don't seem to be any extremely descriptive theories online about what could have happened to Ramona, so this is mostly speculation. You have to keep in mind that there is very little media coverage on Ramona's case. So EPANA investigators did find evidence that has led them to conclusively believe that Ramona did attend the apartment party in Lake Kathleen that Saturday night. And then they believe that she was murdered after she left the party and was walking near Highway 16 to try to hitch a ride to the dance in Hazleton. So from this information that was released to the public, there is a vague theory that Ramona was either on purpose or accidentally run over by a car. Ramona has stated in a few interviews that she does feel that Ramona was hit by a car, but you also have to be aware that Matilda doesn't have Ramona's cause of death. This theory would be consistent with the testimony that Ray received from that man. So there was the theory, this is the theory. So basically, Ramona leaves the party at Lake Kathleen. A bunch of people, a group of people, get into a truck and follow Ramona as she's walking along Highway 16 and then run Ramona over with the car. So as I said, this theory is consistent with what Ray and the witness saw, because he did show Ray the alleged truck that was involved in the incident that's wrecked now from presumably Ramona being hit by it. However, this theory doesn't really explain why Ramona's body was found naked and why the RCMP initially said that they believed it was a sexually motivated crime. If she's just run over by a car, do they assault her body afterwards? Or is she assaulted at the party and then while she's running away she gets hit by the car? I don't know. But the EPANA investigators said they investigated this theory that there was a group of people who watched Ramona get run over by a car and said they have disproven it. I don't know how, they don't release anything. So, and then there is the possibility that Ramona is the victim of a serial killer or a stranger attack. This one seems to be kind of what I think, that as Ramona was walking along Highway 16, maybe she was hit or maybe she was picked up by a stranger or some person driving along Highway 16 under the guise that they would drive her to the dance in Hazelton. Perhaps then whoever picked her up assaulted her and murdered her. This would be consistent with the initial report that the RCMP believed it was a sexually motivated crime, and we don't know the cause of death, so it could literally be anything. Although there's been no suspect officially identified in Ramona's case, it's widely believed that the perpetrator was someone who lives in Smithers or is very familiar with the Smithers area. This is believed because where Ramona's body was found is very difficult to get to if you're not familiar with the location. Therefore, the evidence points to someone that can navigate and knows this area well and wouldn't get lost. It's sort of more difficult for me to conclusively say which theory out of the two that I've presented I lean towards more, because they both seem plausible and we don't have enough evidence in either one to sort of lean, although the RCMP did say the first one was disproven, but the RCMP is so secretive that how do we know? So that's the case of the murder of Ramona Wilson that took place over 26 years ago and still remains unsolved. I do really hope that Matilda, Brenda, and Ramona's family and loved ones do receive answers about what happened to her. After researching into Ramona and just hearing about her, it's very evident to me that she's such a beautiful and kind soul, and that if she had the opportunity to live, that she would have done so much good in the world. I'm also disappointed that historically cases involving white youth such as Jean Benet, Madeleine McCann, Natalie Holloway, etc., get international media coverage when cases like Ramona's that are equally tragic and equally horrific aren't a media sensation in the same way. She barely got national coverage. I bet you most people in Canada don't know about what happened to Ramona, and that's tragic in my opinion. I think all cases deserve to be treated the same way and deserve to receive the same amount of coverage. I want to have the same energy as people have with Jean Benet for Ramona. That's why I don't think I'll ever cover cases like Jean Benet, because it's received so much coverage. What can I add? I haven't seen one video from a true crime creator about Ramona Wilson's murder. I also want to emphasize that I think it's so absurd that Ramona's mother was never told the cause of death by the RCMP. That seems extremely unethical to keep such basic information, to shield such basic information from the family. RCMP has a history and continues to have a history of racism within its institution, and it needs to be confronted and changed. But that's my opinion. Don't sue me, RCMP. So if you have any information about Ramona Wilson's case, I will leave the BC Crime Stoppers number below and the website to contact. It's also on my little board. That's the number you can call. Someone knows something about what happened to Ramona, and it's time that Matilda gets the answers she deserves. Thanks for watching this video. Please like and subscribe if you feel so inclined, and share this video because Ramona hasn't gotten any coverage and she deserves it. Thank you. Bye.